Attention now to the European Union. Its top court has dismissed a legal challenge by a Western Sahara independence group against a trade deal between the European Union on one hand and Morocco on the other, covering agricultural produce and fisheries. Now, the court says that these agreements do not apply to that disputed territory. The ruling will diffuse some tensions between the two parties, which emerged after a lower court ruling about 12 months ago, which ruled that the trade deal should be scrapped altogether.
Excuse us if some of us feel outrage at the existing agreement. You only have to look at the evaluation study to recognise its faults. The study makes absolutely clear that this is the least successful of all the bilateral fisheries agreements agreed by the European Union. It's one in which our taxpayers are paying €36 million a year for what? Very little. And the fish we land doesn't even end up in the European Union. It goes down to Africa or gets sold onto the Asian market.
The news broke before sunrise, and by noon, the entire French fishing industry was in panic. For years, Europe counted on Africa's oceans like they were its own private supermarket. But today, Africa finally said no, a $2 billion deal gone in seconds. Contracts torn apart, French officials calling it a disaster. But what exactly pushed Africa to reject one of Europe's biggest fishing offers? Because beneath the surface of this story is a much bigger truth: years of overfishing, unfair contracts, empty promises, and entire African coastal communities watching their waters get drained while foreign ships took the profit. And today, the tide finally turned. In Senegal, Mauritania, Angola, Namibia, fishermen celebrated like it was Independence Day all over again. Because this wasn't just a business deal. It was Africa reclaiming something Europe thought it would control forever: its ocean, its future, its power. What France didn't expect was the chain reaction that just started. Food prices rising, French factories halting production, coastal cities protesting, and Europe suddenly realizing that without Africa's waters, its entire seafood industry could collapse. This isn't just a rejected deal. This is the day Africa flipped the script and forced Europe to face a reality it's been ignoring for decades. Let's break down how this happened, and why France is calling it a national disaster. The story begins in the early hours of a quiet morning along Africa's Atlantic coastline. From Dakar to Nouadhibou, from Walvis Bay to Luanda, fishermen were preparing for another long day at sea, unaware that a political earthquake was about to reshape the entire region. But in Paris, it was already chaos. Meetings were being called, phones were ringing non-stop. Government officials were rushing into offices with half-read documents and panicked expressions. Why? Because the one thing they did not expect Africa to do, Africa finally did. Africa rejected Europe's $2 billion fish deal. For decades, Europe treated Africa's ocean as a guaranteed supply chain, a bottomless source of fish that kept European supermarkets full, restaurants thriving, and factory lines running like clockwork. Fishing agreements were signed year after year, billions flowed through banks, and foreign ships filled African waters like floating cities. And while Europe declared these deals mutually beneficial, the truth on the ground was much darker. African fishermen watched foreign supertrawlers scoop up more fish in a week than entire villages could catch in a year. Traditional boats returned home half empty. Local industries struggled. Families who lived by the ocean for generations were forced to abandon the very craft that defined their identity. Africa was being paid just enough to stay quiet, but never enough to grow. This rejection, this single moment, was not born in boardrooms. It was born in frustration, in exhaustion, in a continent demanding respect after decades of economic exploitation disguised as cooperation. The $2 billion Europe offered was huge on paper, but it came with strings, conditions, and expectations that Africa was no longer willing to tolerate. The official announcement came from a brief statement, almost too calm for the weight it carried. It read only one line: Africa will not renew the fisheries partnership agreement with the European Union. That was it. No apology, no negotiation, no compromise. Just a line that shook the foundations of Europe's fishing industry. France's immediate reaction was disbelief. French fishing companies depended heavily on African waters. Over 70% of the fish used in France's processing plants came directly or indirectly from African nations. France's factories, markets, restaurants, all tied to the supply chain Africa had just cut off. Within hours, European media outlets called it a shock decision. French politicians used words like unexpected, unacceptable, and disastrous. But African leaders simply replied, the deal was never fair. Behind the scenes, Europe knew Africa had every reason to walk away. Overfishing had reached dangerous levels. Scientific reports showed fish populations dropping year after year. Local communities were suffering as foreign vessels took the majority of the catch. The environmental cost was becoming unbearable, and the economic cost to African livelihoods was far worse. For the first time in decades, African nations formed a unified front. Instead of negotiating separately and being pressured separately, they spoke as one. Senegal, Mauritania, Namibia, and Angola coordinated their positions. They shared data, shared concerns, and realized that together they held enormous power. Europe needed Africa's fish more than Africa needed Europe's money. When Africa's ministers gathered for a final discussion, the message was clear. We cannot sell our oceans if our children will inherit empty seas. That sentence became the turning point. What Europe expected was another round of bargaining, maybe a demand for more money, maybe slight changes, maybe a new clause or two. What it never expected was a complete rejection of the entire agreement. As news spread across African coastlines, something extraordinary happened. Fishermen celebrated, they danced, they shouted, they hugged their children. To the outside world, it might have seemed strange to rejoice over the cancellation of a $2 billion deal. But to these communities, this decision was not just political, it was historical. It was a return of dignity. In Mbor, a fisherman named Issa held a cracked paddle in his hands as he spoke to a local reporter. My father fished in these waters. His father fished in these waters. But for the last 20 years we watched. Foreigners come with machines bigger than our entire village. They dragged everything from the seabed. They left nothing. Today, for the first time, I can breathe. Maybe my son will inherit a sea with fish. Stories like Issa's echoed across West Africa. In Wadhibu, hundreds gathered near the port, cheering as foreign vessels prepared to leave. In Walvis Bay, Namibian fishermen blew horns and waved flags. In Dakar, fishermen marched with banners that read, "Our ocean, our future." But while Africa celebrated, France panicked. The French fishing industry was already under pressure from fuel prices, stricter EU regulations, and declining fish stocks in Europe's own waters. Africa's rejection didn't just disrupt their supply chain, it shattered it. Overnight, prices began to rise. Fish processing factories warned of shortages. Supermarkets prepared to adjust prices. Restaurateurs asked how they would maintain menus when 50-70% of their seafood came from African waters. In Paris, a major seafood distributor admitted on national television, if Africa stands firm, France will face one of the biggest seafood crises in decades. Behind closed doors, French officials scrambled to salvage the agreement. They called ministers. They sent delegations. They proposed amendments to the deal. But Africa was unmoved. This time, they were not negotiating from a position of weakness. They were negotiating from strength. One African minister reportedly told a European diplomat, "If you want access to our waters, respect our people. If you want our fish, help us build industries, not dependence." That sentence summed up Africa's new approach. This wasn't rejection for the sake of rejection. It was a strategic shift. Africa wanted value, not just extraction. Instead of selling fishing rights for pennies, Africa wanted to build its own fishing fleets. Instead of exporting raw fish for Europeans to process, Africa wanted factories on African soil. Instead of letting foreign ships drain its seas, Africa wanted marine protection zones, sustainability programs, and long-term regeneration. Europe never expected these demands. The assumption for decades was that Africa would always accept whatever deal Europe offered. But a new generation of African leadership has emerged confident, assertive, unwilling to repeat the economic mistakes of the past. The pressure from African youth also played a key role. Many young Africans voiced frustration that resources were leaving the continent while unemployment remained high. Why couldn't Africa create its own billion-dollar fish industry? Why couldn't Africa feed its own people first? Why were foreign companies allowed to control so much of Africa's ocean wealth? These questions fueled a movement. This was not just a government decision. It was the voice of a generation tired of watching Africa's wealth leave without transforming African lives. Meanwhile, in France, the language used by politicians became increasingly emotional. One French minister described the rejection as a geopolitical disaster. Another accused Africa of economic betrayal. But such words revealed something deeper. Europe was not used to hearing Africa say no for centuries. Europe acted as if access to Africa was a given. Now Africa was rewriting the terms and Europe didn't know how to respond. This power shift is part of a larger trend. Africa is rising as a global actor, not a passive participant. From agriculture to minerals, from energy to shipping, Africa is increasingly asserting control over its resources. And each time Africa says no, the world listens a little more closely. European analysts warned that Africa's rejection could push fish prices across Europe to record highs. Others fear a ripple effect. If Africa can reject a $2 billion deal without hesitation, what will stop it from rejecting deals worth $10 billion or $20 billion in the future? What if this inspires other regions to challenge Europe's influence? What if Africa partners with Asian nations or builds its own fleet to replace Europe entirely? These questions kept European officials awake at night, but in Africa, this moment was symbolic. It was a reminder that the continent is no longer desperate, no longer silent, no longer forced to accept deals that leave it poorer in the long run. This was Africa choosing sovereignty over short-term profit, and the timing could not have been worse for France. The country is already dealing with internal economic struggles, rising food costs, and unhappy farmers, losing access to Africa's fish only added fuel to the fire. Suddenly, French coastal towns began staging protests. Fishermen blocked roads, factory workers demanded answers, supermarket chains warned of shortages. The French public began asking questions the government could not easily answer. Why were they so dependent on Africa? Why didn't Europe invest in restoring its own fish stocks? Why did a continent thousands of miles away have the power to disrupt France so easily? The truth is simple. Africa holds resources Europe cannot replace. Africa's waters are among the richest fishing grounds in the world. Its coastline stretches over 30,000 kilometers. Its oceans are home to tuna, sardines, mackerel, shrimp, octopus species that power Europe's seafood industry. Europe's own waters are heavily fished, regulated, or depleted. Without Africa, Europe cannot maintain its current consumption levels. But Africa knows this now. And that knowledge is power, political power, economic power, and emotional power. African leaders are using this moment to push for a new era. An era where African oceans benefit African people first. An era where foreign access is not automatic but earned. An era where African coastal communities thrive instead of struggle. In a symbolic moment captured by local media, an elderly fisherman in Senegal stood on the shore at sunset and said, "Europe thought we were weak. They forgot the ocean belongs to us." His words captured the heart of the movement. But this is not just a story about fish, it is a story about sovereignty. A story about a continent refusing to repeat old cycles. A story about balance, fairness, and a global power shift unfolding in real time. Europe must now return to the negotiation table with humility. Africa holds the leverage. Africa sets the terms. Africa controls the ocean. And France, once confident in its influence over the continent, is forced to accept a new reality. The era of easy deals is over. What happens next will shape the future of Africa-Europe relations. Will Europe finally offer fair partnerships? Will Africa build its own fleets? Will new global players step in, offering Africa better deals? Will other African resources, minerals, agriculture, oil, gas follow the same pattern? One thing is clear, this rejection is not the end. It is the beginning of a continent rising to claim what is rightfully its own. And as Europe calls it a disaster, Africa calls it liberation. Because sometimes the most powerful word a nation can say is simply, no. And as we reach the end of this story, it's important to understand something. Something deeper than politics, deeper than business, deeper than any billion-dollar contract. What happened here wasn't just Africa rejecting a European deal. This was a moment of identity, a moment of dignity, a moment where a continent that has fed the world for centuries finally decided it deserves to feed itself first. For decades, African waters have been treated like a bonus zone, a backup pantry for Europe's shortages, a playground for industrial fishing vessels, a place where cheap contracts were signed without ever asking how local families survive, how coastal ecosystems recover, or how African fishermen compete against giant European fleets. But today, Africa spoke with one voice. Not in anger but in clarity, not in revenge but in responsibility, because this decision wasn't just about fish, it was about fairness, it was about balance. It was about ending a silent crisis that coastal communities have lived with for generations. Think of the young fishermen in Ouadhibou, Senegal, Walvis Bay, Luanda, Dar es Salaam men. And women who wake up before sunrise, who depend on the ocean as their lifeline, who for years have watched foreign ships scrape the sea clean before their own boats even touch the water. Think of the mothers in fishing villages who rely on daily catches to feed their children. Think of the elders who remember when the ocean was full, when the coastline was alive, when Africa wasn't treated as a resource bucket for the world's richest countries. Africa's rejection of this to-be deal was more than a financial decision, it was a restoration of balance. A reminder that the world cannot take without giving. A reminder that partnerships must be equal, not extractive. But on the other side of the story, something else is happening. Across France, thousands of families, workers, and businesses are waking up to a new reality. The loss of African fish isn't just a supply issue, it's a cultural shock, an economic blow, and a political earthquake. French coastal towns are already feeling it. Factories that rely on African catch tuna, mackerel, sardines are slowing production. Supermarkets are warning of shortages. Prices are rising. Politicians are scrambling, pointing fingers, demanding explanations. And all of this because Africa made a choice that in truth should have been respected decades ago. The choice to put its people first. But here's the twist in the story, and it's the part that nobody talks about. This could be the beginning of something new, something powerful, something historic. Because when Africa stands firm, when Africa negotiates from a place of strength, when Africa tells the world our resources are not for exploitation, everything changes. Europe is learning that the old playbook no longer works. Africa is learning that saying no is sometimes more powerful than saying yes. And the world is learning that Africa is not just rising, Africa is redefining global economics. This is not the end of the relationship between Africa and Europe, not at all. But it is the end of an era where Europe assumed it had unlimited access to African waters, African minerals, African lands, African markets, African labor. Those days are done. From now on, deals will be different, negotiations will be different, respect will be different, because Africa has realized something priceless. When you control your resources, you control your destiny. When you protect your waters, you protect your future. When you say no to exploitation, you say yes to your people. This story is about fish, but it's really about freedom. It's about a continent choosing itself after centuries of being chosen last. And for millions watching this moment unfold, young Africans especially, this is not just news, this is inspiration. This is proof that power isn't always in the money offered. Sometimes it's in the courage to refuse it. So as we close this chapter, remember this: Africa did not reject $2 billion. Africa invested in its future. And one day, when the history of modern geopolitics is written, this moment, this rejection may be seen as the spark that changed everything. Because sometimes a single no can shake the world.